Hey there, welcome to this episode of the Cutting Room Floor. This is a segment where I go a little deeper into something from a recent message here at Sunny Slope. We get to go down some rabbit trails and look at details in a passage that we might otherwise not have time for in a sermon. And so yesterday we looked at a passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And we looked at how what Paul is actually talking to the Corinthians about is whether if a person was circumcised prior to their coming to faith, should they try to, believe it or not, undo their circumcision? And yes, that was a thing. Yes, that was actually something that people could do. Or if they were circumcised, should they, or if they were uncircumcised, should they become circumcised once they become a Christian? And we looked at how that what Paul is really saying is that our status is, because of the gospel, our status is now defined by our relationship with Christ. And that includes our ethnic status as well as our moral standing before God. And so Paul is actually, he seems rather indifferent towards whether or not a person is circumcised or not. And I mentioned this just very briefly, but yesterday, but I wanted to get a little bit deeper into this because it's a rather interesting question of what in the early church, what place did circumcision play in the life of the believer? And to make that point and to kind of show you what I mean, let me bring my screen up here, and I want to show you a passage that I reference. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 16, and you can look and it's the first few verses. There's this little story where Paul comes to the towns of Lystra and Derbe, and he meets a young man named Timothy. And we know, of course, that Paul becomes very close to Timothy over the years. But one of the things that happens, Paul obviously sees leadership potential in Timothy, and he wants Timothy to accompany him in his missionary work, particularly in the town of Derbe and Lystra and Iconium. One of the things that happens, we read that Paul takes Timothy and had him circumcised because of the Jews who were in those places. Now, that's a rather unusual thing that Paul actually he has this circumcision done. There's a little bit of background here that's probably helpful. We know that Timothy's mother was Jewish and his father was Greek, and that means that in terms of his spiritual heritage, Timothy would have been considered Jewish, but he had followed the custom of his father in that he was a Greek. And so in the eyes of the Jewish people, Timothy would have been viewed with maybe some suspicion would be the right word, or some ambivalence, because on the one hand, he's identified with the Jewish people because of his lineage. He's born into a Jewish family, but on the other hand, he's not faithful to his heritage. And so Timothy, if he's accompanying Paul on these missionary journeys, especially to Jewish communities, Timothy would have been viewed as something almost of a traitor to his own people. Now, another little side note, and I. It's kind of awkward, but the question comes up, well, how would anyone know this, right? Like, this is obviously a very private and personal thing. So how does anybody come to find out whether or not you're circumcised? And the answer is actually fairly simple. It's that in first century times, you have, public baths. And so a person's circumcision status was actually maybe more well known than it would have been. And because it carried some theological weight, let's just say it would be readily identifiable, and people would begin to talk. And so Paul recognizes that contextually there's a need to have Timothy circumcised if he's going to be received by the Jewish communities in which they were ministering. Now, let me take you to another passage. and that is in the book of Galatians, the letter to the Galatians. Here's where once again Paul is he's addressing the topic of circumcision, and here Paul says he's talking to a community, he's talking to a church that has been infiltrated by a group of people known as the Judaizers. Judaizers were people who they claimed to be Christians. They were professing Christians, and yet they wanted to impose Jewish law on the broader community. And Paul does not take kindly to this group of people at all. In fact, he's very harsh in his language. And he says this, I wish those who unsettle you would emasculate themselves. And that is exactly what it sounds like. He's really saying, look, for those who wish to push circumcision on people, I wish they would go further and cut it all off. There's no nice way to say that. That's what Paul is saying. And so you see this contrast, because on the one hand, Paul has no problem taking Timothy to be circumcised. He says, look, if in this case, Timothy, you should get circumcised. It would be a good thing for you to do. And when he's talking to the Galatians, he says, how dare you impose this law of circumcision on people? How dare you do that? And so then the question becomes, well, which is it? What is should we care about circumcision in this case? Is Paul being contradictory? Is he contradicting himself? The answer is this, and here's what I think is important. First of all, there are some key differences between these two passages. In the Acts passage, circumcision would have been a voluntary act. It would have been something that Paul himself would have known, and Timothy no doubt would have known, that they were under no legal compulsion to do this. They know that that by becoming circumcised, it's not that they are keeping the Jewish law as a means to earning God's approval. It's not a means to righteousness in God's sight. And that's a very critical difference. What they are really doing here is they are contextualizing the message of the gospel. They are recognizing that when the gospel crosses cultural and ethnic boundaries, as it always does, there has to be great care in bridging that gap. And you don't want to do anything that is going to cause offense among the people that you are ministering to. And so that means that even in today's culture, when you are bringing the gospel to someone who does not yet believe, then you always have to be sensitive. What things can I do that will better help me communicate the message, and how can I remove potential stumbling blocks so that the gospel will be well received by other people? That's what Paul is doing here. In the Galatian community, Paul understood that the Judaizers within the community are they are using circumcision as a means to establish righteousness or moral standing in God's sight. And so it was not seen as an optional thing for Christians. It was not seen as something that you could do as a way of deferring to a weaker brother, for example, but it was a mandatory thing that a person needed to do in order to secure their standing before God. And for that reason, when circumcision becomes a means of, or in our case, when any moral action becomes a stepping stone up to God, then we ought to be very quick to reject that. We ought to recognize the sinful motive behind that. And that's why Paul is opposed to it in Galatians. So there's a difference here. And that's why Paul can say in Corinthians, in fact, he even says it in Galatians, circumcision, uncircumcision, not the point. What really matters is love, faith expressing itself through love. Or in 1 Corinthians 7, what matters is keeping the commandments. It's obedience that flows out of a circumcised heart. So there are differences there. It might look like there's contradictions, but Paul, one of the approaches is a way of contextualizing the gospel. The other is a way of establishing righteousness. And when it's a means of establishing righteousness, Paul is vehemently opposed. When it's a way of contextualizing the gospel, Paul welcomes the opportunity to do it. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the videos. There'll be more that come up, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.